So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. I know you voted against it, although, as I understand it, you are in favor of the idea of providing something upwards of $50 billion to promote manufacturing onshore. Is that? Let's start with what you agree with in it.
Well, right. And you mentioned the CHIPS Act, which is a bill designed to build up the resiliency of our domestic supply chain for semiconductors. You know, we only manufacture about 12% of all of the semiconductors that we use. That's why we have a chip shortage for both consumer electronics and the automobile sector. So we definitely need to decrease our dependency on foreign sources, especially sources of semiconductors from China and Taiwan and the Asia Pacific, where we're sourcing upwards of 80% of all of our semiconductors. So that supply chain resiliency is certainly something we need to do. The problem with today's bill is it was a totally partisan exercise. It was really not about enhancing U.S. competitiveness vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. It was more of a repackaged Green New Deal bill, or Build Back Better bill, that was totally partisan. It included, for example, $8 billion in U.S. taxpayer money to a United Nations Green Climate Slush Fund, and much of that money actually goes to China. I don't know why we think we're going to enhance American competitiveness by sending U.S. taxpayer dollars to a UN Green Climate Fund that goes to subsidize the manufacturing of solar panels in the Zhejiang province that uses slave labor, Uyghur slave labor. That's not going to enhance our competitiveness. And while the Competes Act, the so-called Competes Act, included funding for the CHIPS Act, which I support, there was a lot of just giveaways for Democrat Party pet projects like preferencing unions. I don't think preferencing unions is going to make America compete more effectively with China. What we don't have in this bill is a very serious strategy to counter the threats from China. I'm a member of the House China Task Force, and this was a very serious project undertaken by 11 committees in the U.S. House. Over the course of 12 months, we issued a report that included over 400 recommendations after consulting with 130 experts from members of both the current and previous administrations. We consulted with ambassadors and experts and business executives, and we came up with over 400 real serious recommendations to enhance U.S. competitiveness in 6 different areas, and 2/3 of those recommendations were bipartisan. None of those recommendations were included in the so-called Competes Act, and that's why we actually think it should be called the America Concedes Act, because it actually would undermine American competitiveness.
Well, just to be clear for our audience, it's called the Competes Act in the bill. That's the title of it, which passed the House of Representatives. The Senate has a version of something very different, so it's not clear how much of this will see the light of day. There'll have to be a lot of backing and forth between the House and the Senate. But let's come back to the strategy with respect to China. Do you fundamentally agree, put aside some of the bells and whistles that you disagree with, do you fundamentally agree we've got to build up our capacity, both in manufacturing, designing chips here, but also there's a lot of money in there for the National Science Foundation in basic research? Because are we, let me put it bluntly, are we behind China when it comes to tech?
Well, in some areas, we most certainly are. Look at hypersonic weapons that China is ahead of us. They're ahead of us in some respects in cyberspace and cybersecurity. And certainly because of the theft of the intellectual property, the forced transfer of technology, the fact that China is engaged in unfair trade practices, yes, they have attained an edge in certain areas. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think one of the key dimensions of our strategic competition with China right now is we've got to recognize that in many respects, American investors are unwittingly financing and fueling the rise of China's competitiveness with us. We have to seriously examine Chinese access to Western capital markets and look at that capital flows issue. We believe in an open and free society that there should be a free exchange of capital across border. But when American investors are fueling and financing the rise of China, and especially when it comes to Chinese technology, military surveillance companies that threaten our national security, we need to take a serious look at Chinese access to those capital markets and look at those capital flows. The Competes Act that was put on the floor today did nothing to address the real problem of Chinese access to Western capital flows. And the American people and investors should not be unwittingly financing Chinese military and surveillance companies that threaten our national security.
Congressman, there is, of course, financial capital, which is terribly important in the tech area. There's also intellectual capital or people capital. Do we in the United States at this point have, and are we doing what we need to do to make sure we have the intellectual capital, both in developing our own students here and graduate, postgraduate, but also in allowing people from overseas to come here, study, and stay here?
Well, I support some visa reforms, but we have to make sure that we're not irresponsible with those visa reforms in a way that could contribute to academic or research espionage. So you've got to be very careful about how you do that. Obviously, we do need intellectual capital, and we need to invest in our own people. And so there were some provisions in the Concedes Act that I support that would again, help finance education, help career and technical education, more Pell Grants, for example. We need to invest in our own people, not just look to foreign sources of intellectual capital.
And finally, Congressman, let's talk about those jobs numbers, because we've been talking about them all day long now. They surprised dramatically upside, including surprised the White House in a good way. How does that resonate back in Kentucky, your home state? Are you seeing job growth there? Is your unemployment level going down?
Well, not really. I mean, it's obviously that was a good number, and we're glad that it was a good number. The problem is there's a reason why 75% of Americans think that the economy is performing poorly overall. Even with these job numbers today, you still have 11 million unfilled job vacancies. And if there's one thing that employers back in Kentucky and across this country tell members of Congress, it's that we cannot find workers. There's 6.5 million Americans who are still unemployed, despite today's job numbers, and there's 11 million job openings in this country. Not to mention the fact that wages in inflation-adjusted terms, real wages, are actually down 8 of the last 11 months. And the reason for that is because of this inflation crisis. Inflation is at a 40-year high in this country. It's a classic supply-demand mismatch, in addition to some monetary policy mistakes by the Fed, which has exacerbated those fiscal policy mistakes. But when you create excess demand through overspending, while at the same time constraining supply by an all-out war on energy, domestic energy, or you're paying people to not work, creating a labor shortage, overall, you've got a supply-demand mismatch, and that's why you see inflation at a 40-year high. Right. Most Kentuckians that I talk to, these price increases are really crippling. And so while we like to see these job numbers, we still have 11 million job openings in this country, and inflation is totally out of control.
Congressman, on the supply-demand mismatch, particularly in the labor market, doesn't the market take care of that? We saw, again, wages rising pretty substantially. Is that fixing the problem over time?
Well, wages in absolute terms rising, but in real terms, in inflation-adjusted terms, they're actually going down. The Wharton School did a study recently, published a study recently that said that in 2021, because of the inflation crisis, the average American household was spending $3,500 more on the same goods and services that they purchased in previous years. So while wages are going up, primarily because of this labor shortage, you have inflation going up and stripping away whatever gains Americans are seeing in their paychecks. Obviously, employers are going to have to pay more because there's more competition for labor. There's a labor shortage. But that increased labor cost is being passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. What we need is to get inflation under control so that wage growth is more meaningful for the American worker. And that's not what is happening right now. And as I said before, it's not just a matter of overregulation and fiscal policy mistakes. The Federal Reserve has been really slow in its normalization program. We need to get back to a more normal monetary policy quicker. And the fact that the Fed has been so slow to normalize interest rates and end the bond buying program, I think has contributed to the inflationary pressures that we're seeing in the economy.
Yeah, and we'll see whether those jobs numbers today might give the Fed a little bit of a nudge in that direction. Thank you so much, Congressman, for being with us today. That's Representative Andy Barr, Republican of Kentucky. Coming up, President Putin gets a little help from his friend President Xi.